Inflation is a very simple concept. It's just the money supply expanding. And so the more money there is, right, that's what you're inflating. That's where the word literally comes from. Over time, the government has been very successful in changing the definition of inflation to fool the public as to its source. Because if the public understood what inflation was, they would know that it's not caused by grocery stores. You know, when Kamala Harris says it's greedy grocery stores that are causing inflation, if you understand that inflation is an increase in the money supply, well, you know it can't possibly be the grocery stores because they don't have a printing press. They can't expand the money supply. But if you think that inflation is rising prices, well, yeah, the grocery store keeps raising my prices, so they're causing inflation. They're raising prices because the government created inflation. Prices are going up in response to the inflation that's been created. By changing the definition of inflation, the government not only confuses the public as to who's creating it, but now they're able to blame it on other factors like greedy corporations or Putin. You know, that was, Biden kept talking about Putin, and Putin was causing the inflation. There's only one source of inflation in America, and that's the Federal Reserve. But the reason the Federal Reserve is creating all that inflation is because the government is running massive deficits. And so the Federal Reserve is financing those deficits by buying those bonds with the inflation that it creates, the money that it prints. The best way to look at inflation is a tax. Inflation is what we pay for the government that we don't pay for with the income tax or the Social Security tax or a sales tax. Basically, the deficits, the federal budget deficits, we end up funding them by inflation. And those deficits are about to skyrocket. They've been skyrocketing. And so the inflation tax is going to be much bigger in 2025 than it was this year, regardless of what the Fed is trying to tell us. The Fed is now focused on employment, the economy, which has clearly come under a lot of pressure recently, is very close to officially, I think, falling into recession. I think we've been in recession pretty much the whole time. I just don't even believe the numbers the way the government manufactures them. So I don't think we've ever had a strong economy. I just think that that's just been a statistical anomaly. And even if you look through the statistics, you can actually see a lot of the inherent weakness that is being masked by a lot of these superficial numbers. But when the Fed stopped hiking rates, it was because banks started to fail. If you remember what happened with Signature Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, a few banks started to fail as a result of rising interest rates. And then the Fed really backed off. And of course, they had to have a big bailout program to prevent a lot more banks from suffering a similar fate. But that's really when the rate hikes stopped. And so the Fed kind of kept rates where they were, but kept implying that, look, we're going to cut eventually. We just need enough proof that inflation is going back down to 2%. And they said, we're not going to wait for 2%. We just have to believe that it's going there. Now, of course, the reason they're not going to wait for 2% is because it's never going to get to 2%. And they probably know that. But at this point, the jobs numbers are getting so bad. The non-farm payroll report that we had, the most recent one, was horrible. And now the government fessed up and came back and said, 818,000 jobs that we claimed were created. Oh, we made a mistake. They're not actually there. And I think they made a bigger mistake. I think there's actually a lot more jobs that they're pretending were created that aren't really there. And in fact, the only reason that we have more jobs now than when Biden was elected is because so many people have 2 or 3 jobs. That's where all the jobs are coming from. It's moonlighting. And the people that now have 2 or 3 jobs, they don't want all these jobs. They'd like to be able to support their family on one job. But unfortunately, the rent's gone up so much, the grocery bill, the utility bill, the insurance, everything is now so expensive because of all this inflation that people have to work multiple jobs. And now Joe Biden wants to claim credit for creating those jobs. But the public blames him for the fact that people are forced to work those jobs. But I think it's the weakness in the economy that is prompting the Fed to cut rates, which they're going to do. They've now prepared the markets for these cuts, and they're not going to just do one and done. This is going to be the beginning of as many rate cuts as they can get away with. And I think ultimately they're going to return to QE. They've already reduced the size of their quantitative tightening program. And I think that was the first step to reversing it and going back to QE, which is inflation creation. QE is just, another word for inflation, but that's really what it is. But the Fed has to pretend that it's finished the job on inflation. It can't, be honest and say, look, we still have high inflation and it's going to go up, but, we don't care. So they have to pretend that the 3% inflation that we have now is going to go down to 2%. But we've been at 3% now for over a year, right? We went down from 9 to about 3, but there's no indication that we're going from 3 to 2. In fact, if you look at the market indicators, when Powell, delivered his statements, his Humphrey Hawk, Jackson Hole speech, on that day, gold was at a new record high, and the US dollar index sank to a 13-month low. So when you see a weak dollar and when you see surging gold prices, that's an indication that monetary policy is too easy and that inflation is going up, not down. In fact, the only reason that inflation came from 9% year over year to 3% was because we got a 24% rise in the value of the dollar. That happened. And after that big rise in the value of the dollar, then prices started to come down because the dollar was so much more valuable relative to other currencies. That brought down commodity prices and that brought down the CPI. But now the dollar has already fallen 10% from its peak, and it looks like it's going to fall a lot more. This weak dollar is going to be a huge tailwind for inflation, and record high gold prices are telling you that that's exactly what's going to happen. The way politicians get elected is they promise the voters something for nothing. That's what people vote for. It's like, what are you going to give me? If I vote for you, what's in it for me? What do I get? People want free stuff. What are you going to give me that I don't now have? Right? Because that's what people are voting for. This is the inherent flaw in that type of system. And we're just demonstrating it all over again. Not like we need to. History is littered with examples of failed democracies for the same reason that we're failing now. But the politicians want to get elected, and so they want to give voters something for nothing. Well, how do they do that? Well, they create inflation. They give voters stuff that they don't make them pay for through taxes. See, if the government said, okay, we're going to give you health care, education, and here's the bill, right? We're going to raise your taxes so that you can get this benefit. The people would like, well, I forget, I don't want that. I don't want my taxes to go up. But when they say, look, we're going to give you this stuff and your taxes aren't going to go up, right? You're getting it for free, then that sounds great. Or we'll just tax the rich to pay for it. Well, the problem is they can't get enough money from the rich to pay for all these promises. So where do they get the money? Well, they just create it. So that's inflation. And so instead of taking your money, they just take your purchasing power. And so now everything you want to buy is more expensive. And the difference between what prices would have been without all those government programs and how much higher they are as a result of those programs, that's your tax. The people don't know that they're paying a tax. They just think they're paying prices and they blame the business. It's great for the government because now the government can say, you see, capitalism is bad. See, these greedy businessmen are gouging you by jacking up your prices. When they're not, they're simply passing on the higher costs that they themselves have to pay to stay in business. And those costs are going up because of the inflation that the government is creating. But, the government obviously, too, since they create inflation, they want to lie about how bad it is. They don't want to acknowledge it. So the way it's measured doesn't come close to capturing the true increase in the cost of living. They've changed the methodology for the CPI over the years to make the number smaller or littler. They did the same thing with unemployment. Unemployment is only low because we changed how we measure it. There are lots of people today who are unemployed who we don't count. But if you go back in the past, those people that we don't count today used to be counted. And so the main reason that unemployment is low now is because so many people that we used to count as unemployed in the past, we don't count them anymore. In fact, we have a lot of those people now. If we still counted unemployment the way we counted it before 1994, we'd have unemployment above 10% right now. So there's no way anybody would be able to claim we've got low unemployment if it was 10%. So you take 3/4 of the unemployed and you don't count them anymore. And it's only 4%. And now Biden gets to brag about how low the unemployment is. Meanwhile, we've got a lot of people who are unemployed who are not in the statistics. And the same thing with inflation. Inflation is a lot higher than the CPI reveals. Even if we can get inflation down to 2%, it wouldn't be 2%, it'd be 4 or 5%. And right now, they're saying it's 3% because it's probably 6%. So it's not even close to the 2% target that the Fed claims it has. In order to really solve the inflation problem, it's going to take a much bigger increase in rates than what the Fed has delivered. But the problem is we have so much debt that that's impossible. Go back to Paul Volcker in the 1980s. I mean, we have a bigger inflation problem now than we had in the 70s. And to bring that inflation to an end required 20% interest rates. Now, what would happen if interest rates went to 20% now? I mean, we got up to 5%. Imagine if they got up to 20%. Well, we've got a $35 trillion national debt that's financed with treasury bills. Even if we had to finance that at 10%, that's $3.5 trillion a year in interest on the debt. The U.S. government only collects about $4 trillion a year in taxes in total. So we have so much debt. Imagine what would happen to all these corporate bonds if their debt matured and they had to refinance it at 20%, anywhere close to that. Or home mortgages that got up, 10% or 12% or 14%, something like that. We now have so much debt that if you tried to raise interest rates high enough to get rid of inflation, everything would collapse, which is why they're not going to do it. We are stuck with inflation because the alternative is a political non-starter. Because if the Fed actually got rid of inflation, you would have a financial crisis that would make 2008 look like a Sunday school picnic. But the point is that they can't raise interest rates high enough to fight inflation without creating a financial crisis. And so that's why they didn't do it. That's why they stopped at, 5.25%. Because the only way that interest rates slow down inflation is by slowing down debt. They have to get people to borrow less and save more. But even though the Fed raised interest rates, nobody borrowed less. Deficit spending at the federal level went up. Household debt went up. Credit card debt hit all-time record highs. So the Fed never actually got to restrictive monetary policy. They never got to a situation where interest rates were so high that governments and individuals stopped borrowing and started saving. But also, if interest rates got to that level, nobody could afford it. We'd have a complete economic implosion, and the government would have to default on its promises, including its treasury bonds, but it would have to tell people on Social Security that they're not going to get the money that they were promised. And so none of this is politically viable. So what the politicians are choosing is just to have endless inflation. And that takes them off the hook because they don't have to cut Social Security. They just give you the Social Security benefits and you just can't buy very much because everything costs money, right? They don't default on the bonds. They pay everybody with money they print. So instead of honestly telling people, we don't have the money to pay you, and so we're going to have to pay you less than we promised, they pay everybody off, but the net effect is you get less because the money buys less. So you lose through inflation instead of through an honest default. But that is always the path that the politicians want to go down because they never have to accept responsibility for creating the inflation. They're always going to blame it on somebody else. And that's why I know that price controls are coming. I mean, I talked about this long before Kamala Harris proposed it, that we were going to get price controls because ultimately that's all the government's got is to blame the businesses and to pass laws to stop people from raising prices. But that never stops the inflation. It just causes the inflation to go underground into the black market because legally you can't buy anything because the prices are too low. And so there's a shortage of everything that you need. And in order to buy the things that you need, you have to go and buy it from a criminal because they're the only ones who will sell it to you. But now you got to pay through the nose because, the guy who's selling you illegal food risks going to jail. Donald Trump doesn't want to cut Social Security. In fact, he wants to increase Social Security benefits because he wants to eliminate the tax on Social Security, which is like effectively raising Social Security benefits. So he hasn't identified anything that he's going to cut or eliminate. He talks about waste and abuse, but everybody talks about that. But nobody wants to cut anything. Donald Trump talks about increasing the defense budget. Well, where's that money going to come from? Right? So both candidates want more government, and so they're going to end up with more inflation. Regardless of what they're promising, And of course, Donald Trump is partially responsible for the inflation under Biden because a lot of the money that is being used to bid up prices now was printed when Trump was president because Trump ran enormous deficits. Biden is just running even bigger deficits than Trump. Trump set the record for the most amount of deficit spending by a president in a single term, and Biden is going to break that record by the time his term is over. And before that, Barack Obama, he set the record for the most debt under any president, but that's because he had 8 years. But now presidents are doing in 4 years what it took Obama 8 years to do. But this thing is just spiraling. That's why we've got all this inflation. It's not a coincidence. It's cause and effect. And when the Biden administration tries to say, well, you can't blame us for inflation because they've got inflation in Europe, well, because they made the same mistakes in Europe. They did the same thing. They printed a bunch of euros. They had their own QE program. They called it their asset purchase program. They kept interest rates at zero. In fact, they even had interest rates negative. So all these central banks were operating from the same flawed playbook. They all created massive inflation in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and then upped the ante with COVID. And now the whole world is reaping the whirlwind as all those inflation chickens come home to roost.